in Action.
Last week, the Queen celebrated her official 65th birthday with the customary pomp and splendour. But behind the pageantry, royalty has become a highly profitable business for the House of Windsor. Today, the Queen is one of the richest people in the world. The Queen has been able to achieve her great wealth partly because she's free from paying tax. She pays no income tax, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax, no poll tax.
She is the person with the largest income in the country, and therefore if you're looking at the leaders setting an example, then they should set an example by paying their dues.
Most people believe that the royal family has never paid tax, but Queen Victoria did and was happy to do so. Her son, Edward VII, grumbled about it, yet he still paid. But in the last 80 years, this royal tradition of tax-paying came to an end. Tonight, World in Action reveals how, since 1910, the royal family have secretly lobbied governments to stop paying tax. This royal tax avoidance has turned the once debt-ridden monarchy into today's dynasty of fabulous wealth, a dynasty known in royal circles as the Firm. Every year, the taxpayer pays out a salary to the Queen and the leading members of the royal family. The civil list includes the cost of state visits and the expenses of running the royal households. Last July, the civil list was fixed for the next 10 years. The Queen gets £7.9 million a year. The Queen Mother, £640,000. The Duke of Edinburgh, £360,000. Prince Andrew, £250,000. Princess Anne, £230,000. Princess Margaret, £220,000. Prince Edward, £100,000. And there's more.
The royal flight, which is very expensive, is quite rightly paid for by the state. And the yacht, the royal yacht, what would the royal yacht cost to run a year? £1.5 million must do at the very least. That's paid for by the state. And many other things are paid for by the state on top of what the Queen gets, the palaces and so forth. I wish someone would maintain my home free, gratis and for nothing. I think I'd be willing to pay all my money away in taxes then.
Today, the total cost of keeping the royal family is more than £56 million per year.
It's not cheap, but it's not extravagant, and it's worth the money that's spent on it. While there's something to be said for a republic, and while there's something to be said for a grand monarchy, for a cheap tawdry monarchy, there's nothing to be said at all. So you've got to have a splendid monarchy. It's a great natural strength to us to have this institution which sums up our aspirations as a nation as a whole.
Most people in Britain support the idea of a monarchy, but there is an increasing concern about the size of her private fortune. So, what is the Queen really worth? The great estates of Sandringham and Balmoral belong to her personally. Property experts say they're worth at least £100 million. She also owns 3 racing studs, a stable, and receives £3 million per year from the Duchy of Lancaster's estates. It's more difficult to assess the value of the Queen's huge royal art collection of 5,000 paintings and 30,000 drawings. It includes Vermeer, Rembrandt, Rubens, 53 Canalettos, and 300 drawings by Leonardo da Vinci. The royal collection matches the world's finest galleries, but its sheer size and quality makes it virtually priceless. It's even more difficult to assess the value of the royal jewel collection. The crown jewels are kept in the Tower of London and belong to the nation. But the question remains with the royal jewellery.
Conferences on economic and monetary union.
The royal jewel collection is so enormous you can't believe how many tiaras, necklaces, rings, earrings there are in it. And only a tiny fraction, only a tip of the iceberg is actually worn in public. The rest is buried in the vaults, and there's a lot there. And you're talking here about jewels and stones that if you put them up for public sale at one of these auctions would be the most expensive jewels that have ever been sold in the world.
The jewels have been passed down through the royal family. Many are gifts from foreign rulers and heads of state. But do they belong to the Queen or the state?
How they define, any of them, what is state and private jewellery seems to me to be something of a whim. If they like something that they're given, then it becomes a personal piece and is worn. If they don't like it too much, it's either passed on to somebody else or, treated as state jewellery. Very much something that's an unclear, a blurred line between public and private.
In 1911, King George and Queen Mary held court at the Great Delhi Durbar, a massive open-air pageant organised by Indian princes. Gifts of jewellery were lavished upon the royal couple.
Nobody quite knows what happened to a lot of these historic pieces which were given at the Durbar, really from one state to the empire. Where are they? Well, we'd love to know where they all are. I believe that when Princess Diana cavorted around Australia on the dance floor with emeralds round her head in a squaw's headband, those were emeralds that came from India, part of the great inheritance. But they're not advertised, as you might say, as such.
2 years ago, a leading New York jeweller estimated from photographs that just 33 pieces of the Queen's jewellery were worth a minimum of £35 million. But taking into consideration who owns them, he said they could be worth 10 times that. But the hardest thing to value is the Queen's private investments, her portfolio of stocks and shares. To find out who owns shares in British companies, you go to Companies House in the City of London. But you won't find details of the British royal family's holdings there. They're protected by a discreet clause in the 1976 Companies Act. This enables heads of state to hide their dealing behind a special company, the Bank of England nominees. World in Action found that the Bank of England nominees own shares in most of Britain's top 30 companies. In the past, they've had substantial holdings in Rio Tinto Zinc, a company criticised for its role in mining in southern Africa. Today, the Bank of England nominees own 2.2 million shares worth £28 million in Glaxo. They also own 9 million shares in British Petroleum, worth £30 million. Today, we can't be certain if these shares are held by the Queen or by another head of state, say the Sultan of Brunei.
I think that the holdings, the financial holdings, the wealth of the monarch is a matter of public record. And, for example, people might want to know whether shares were held over the last decade in South African companies or whether they were held in British industry. There are perfectly proper concerns about the way the monarch, of all people, invest their money, whether it's public money or their own private money. Then I think they have an obligation to be accountable.
The sums are not astronomical, and the Queen herself gets very annoyed when it's said that she has this immense private income, because of course she doesn't, and she's very careful. The Queen goes round turning off the lights, not turning them on.
The secrecy surrounding the Queen's wealth means that no one knows what she's worth. In April, the Sunday Times said the Queen was the richest person in Britain with a personal fortune of £7 billion. Harper's and Queen magazine claimed she's the richest woman in the world with a fortune of £6.6 billion. They said her share portfolio is worth £3 billion and increases by 1.8 million per day. These estimates are not supported by hard evidence. The only official guide came in 1971 from the Queen's then private advisor, Lord Cobbold. He said the Queen wanted it to be known that estimates of her portfolio being worth between £50 and £100 million were wildly exaggerated. World in Action took a more reasonable figure for 1971. we asked a leading firm of city stockbrokers how much £30 million, sensibly invested in UK shares then, would now be worth. They advised that it would have grown to a staggering £496 million. By 2001, it'll be worth £2.1 billion. On this basis, the Queen's portfolio currently earns nearly £2 million per week. Today, then, royalty is big business. But when Victoria came to the throne in 1837, she inherited £50,000 of debt from her father. Her husband and consort, Prince Albert, constantly complained about being short of money. In 1850, he wrote a long private begging letter to Lord John Russell, the Prime Minister. Albert pleaded that he needed more money for
the ordinary establishment and pursuits of an English gentleman.
Those he listed included
a hunting establishment, a pack of hounds, a breeding stud, a shooting establishment, a moor or forest in the Highlands of Scotland, a farm, etc., etc.
Author Philip Hall has been investigating the royal finances for many years. He found that Prince Albert's begging letter was not unique.
In 1920, we have a letter from the King's financial advisor. He says George V needed a considerable increase in the civil list to keep the monarchy going. And he sort of makes a mock threat that if they don't get more money, then the King will have to go to Parliament, open Parliament, arriving from a taxicab.
50 years later, another royal consort, Prince Philip, was still complaining about the lack of money. He blamed rising inflation.
We go into the red, I think, next year. We shall either have to, I don't know, we may have to move into smaller premises, who knows? We've closed down, well, we've instance, we had a small yacht which we had to sell, and I shall probably have to give up polo fairly soon, things like that.
Philip Hall then investigated the history of tax-paying by the monarchy. In 1842, income tax of 3% on high wage earners was introduced. Hall found that Queen Victoria had no hesitation in agreeing to pay, as the Prime Minister reported to Parliament.
Her Majesty stated that if the financial condition of the country was such that Parliament would think it necessary to subject all incomes to a certain charge, it was her determination that her own income should be subject to a similar burden.
Victoria's long reign lasted until 1901. She had paid over £500,000 income tax.
It set a precedent in some ways because she paid for 60 years, and in fact in 1871 she was accused of not paying tax, and she was very indignant about this, and she insisted that the government declare publicly that she was a taxpayer like everybody else.
Victoria was succeeded by her son Edward VII. The government told him that he would have to follow Victoria's example and pay income tax. But Philip Hall's research in the Bodleian Library at Oxford reveals that Edward VII wasn't happy.
Well, he certainly didn't want to pay it. One minister describes his attitude as being very sore about being made to pay income tax by the cabinet. And subsequent letters show that he still was trying to get out of it in the middle of his reign, and after he died, a Treasury official said that he never ceased to protest about paying income tax.
In all, Edward VII had to pay £18,000 tax each year on his civil list and about the same amount on his private income, about £2 million at today's value. In 1910, Edward VII was succeeded by his son, George V. Immediately, the tradition of a tax-paying monarchy began to erode. Philip Hall has charted 7 stages by which the royal family achieved massive tax privileges. The first came in 1910 with the new King's civil list. The Liberal government decided that George V would now have to pay for state visits himself, but in return he would no longer have to pay income tax on the civil list.
It was a break from tradition. Since 1842, nearly 70 years, tax paying had been the norm. So in 1910, there is a turnaround. The floodgates open in a sense because this decision is followed by all the others.
In 1913, the second stage, Queen Victoria's remaining children were given generous tax privileges. In 1921, Edward VII's widow, Queen Alexandra, was exempted on £64,000 out of her £70,000 a year allowance. And in 1922, the children of George V were exempted from tax on 80% of their state income, and there was more to come. The fifth stage related to the Duchy of Cornwall, 120,000 acres spread over 20 counties, mostly Devon and Cornwall. But the most valuable part of the duchy is in South London. It owns 45 acres of property in Kennington, including the Oval Cricket Ground. Since the 14th century, the estates of the Duchy of Cornwall have been inherited by the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales. From Queen Victoria's time until 1921, income tax and super tax were paid in full on all the revenues of the duchy. In 1921, the Prince of Wales was Edward, later to become the Duke of Windsor. In that year, Edward secretly applied to have income tax removed on the duchy. He offered to pay a donation of £20,000 each year to the Exchequer if tax was lifted. The agreed deal saved him a great amount of money.
Once you know that, in fact, he used to pay a lot of tax, once you know that this voluntary contribution is a good deal less than the tax he had been paying, then you see it not as a public-spirited gesture, but a way of saving money for the Prince of Wales, which is what it was.
Today's owner of the Duchy of Cornwall is Prince Charles. When he became 21, he made a voluntary donation to the Treasury of 50% of his income. In 1981, however, after his wedding, Charles's donation was halved to 25%.
Basically, it saves him £375,000 a year, which is the difference between what he would pay if he was paying 40% income tax and the voluntary contribution that he makes at the lower rate of 25%.
Today, the duchy estates are worth over £250 million, with an income of £2.5 million per year. Prince Charles doesn't pay death duties, capital gains tax or income tax on his duchy revenues. He's one of the 10 richest men in Britain. The sixth stage of royal tax exemption was to come during the Depression of the 1930s, a time of high unemployment and the means test. George V said he was determined to do his bit. He took a 10% cut from the civil list from 1931 to 1935. But there was a catch to his generosity. These are the estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, 50,000 acres, mainly in the north of England, all belonging to the monarch. Income tax had been paid on the duchy by Victoria, Edward VII and George V. But a key document shows that at the same time he was taking a pay cut, the king was secretly lobbying to escape paying tax on his Duchy of Lancaster income.
It says, in 1932, it was represented to the Chancellor of the Exchequer that His Majesty would wish to be relieved of the charge of income tax from the duchy revenues. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer removed the tax, and they've not paid since.
Last year, the profits from the Duchy of Lancaster were worth £3.7 million. So when George VI came to the throne in 1936, the programme of providing a tax-free monarch was virtually complete. But there was still one stage left, the king's tax exemption on investments like stocks and shares. Philip Hall discovered that by 1952 this gap had been closed. But who approved it, and when did it happen?
There is one here which looks like it's very interesting as regards to taxation, because it's under a heading, Taxation Income Tax, and its title is Royal Family Civil List. So it looks like there's a lot of interesting material there, but that has not been sent to the Public Records Office.
So it's not even here?
It's not even here, you know, awaiting to be opened at some later date.
We asked John Walford of the Public Records Office to explain the mystery of the missing documents.
Is it correct the material relating to the royal family is often held out for up to 100 years?
It quite frequently is, yes.
So that might happen to this?
Yes.
So it may be 2038 before we get to see what's in this file?
That's possible.
In fact, we shall never see it. Last Friday, in reply to a parliamentary question, a junior Treasury Minister admitted that this file had been destroyed in 1977. In 1952, the present Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. That year, the Chancellor of the Exchequer told the Commons that the sovereign naturally is free from tax. In fact, in a 40-year period, the monarchy had gone from paying tax to being totally tax-exempt.
Of course, the distinguishing feature of all of this is that it is done with the minimum public scrutiny. It has been a secret process, and at the end of the day, you end up now with this extremely cushy arrangement where there is virtual freedom from taxation in all its forms.
Both the government and the palace say that the Queen is not liable to tax on either her public or her personal finance. She claims Crown immunity.
All money raised in the country is raised on the authority of the Crown and paid over to the Crown. It's therefore a legal contradiction that the institution from which this authority flows could in fact be taxed itself. That really is the heart of the constitutional matter. It is a general constitutional impossibility for the Crown itself to be taxed.
But in his research, Philip Hall came to the belief that the Queen's tax-free status no longer has legal standing.
If you go back centuries, kings were the governments. They raised taxes, they fought wars. The king was not just king in name only. Nowadays, the monarch really doesn't run the government. The governments are run from ministries, they raise taxes. So the Queen is, as regards her private income, really a private person. And, you know, why should she have tax exemption on that private income?
A leading law professor, John Griffith, has read the case law and now supports Philip Hall's view.
With the Queen, you have two sets of functions, two sets of personality. One, the legal personality, or the public personality, and the other, the private personality. Now, she receives a lot of money, obviously, for the performance of her public duties. And that money which she receives in that capacity, I would think, is clearly not taxable. On the other hand, it seems to me that the money the Queen receives from her private investments and from property and so on, is money which she does not receive on behalf of the Crown, but on her own behalf. And as such, I believe she should be taxable.
Next week, MPs will debate a 10-minute bill to abolish the Queen's tax exemption. The proposer is Simon Hughes.
And as an MP for an inner-city constituency where there are many people scraping around on 28 or 45 pounds a week, I think it's extremely unfair that somebody who gets 1.8 million a day, or whatever the figure is, should not pay any tax on it at all, while people here pay tax on pathetically minute amounts.
I do have an objection, as I think any thinking person does, that in a modern world some people are treated differently to others, but they're treated differently in any case. Why should they be treated differently on tax as well?
I suppose it's part of the trappings of monarchy that there will be a vast wealth. But when you're actually in the business of increasing that wealth in a fairly systematic and studied way, then I can see no grounds for saying that that process should be exempt from taxation.
It's a very difficult position to defend, save in constitutional and historical terms. That's why I think it may be modified at some time in the future. I don't think myself it's totally acceptable in the modern world that her private income shouldn't be taxed. Anyhow, good luck to her. I wish my income weren't taxed, such as it is.
According to a recent public opinion poll in The Independent, 4 out of 5 British people think the Queen should pay tax. Our tax expert told us that if the Queen's private investments are worth £500 million, she will save £600,000 this week in tax.
Like anyone else, sometimes they might see red.
And if the